The Birail tools allow you to take a profile curve and sweep it along a pair of rail curves, almost as if it were a car and a train going along a pair of train tracks. Now, what I'm going to be doing in this video is just focusing primarily on the Birail 1 tool, and then in later videos we'll talk about Birail 2 and 3, but I do want to kind of mention what those numbers are for. The numbers you see after Birail control how many profile curves are going to be taken into account. Birail 1 uses a single profile curve, Birail 2 will blend between 2 profile curves, and Birail 3 will use 3 or more profile curves. And you'll see what I mean by that as we go along. First off, let me create a profile curve. I'll go into the side view, and let me grab my CV curve tool, and I'll just make a really cool looking shape, and I'll do a little bit of grid snapping. Actually, let me undo that. I want to make sure my grid snapping is working, and we'll grid snap here and grid snap here. The reason I'm snapping is just to make my life a little bit easier when I create the rails. When you create rails, you must realize that the rails must touch the base of your profile curve, and that's something that you'll run into, and it can actually bite you quite a bit when you're doing Birails. Now notice I'm taking my 2 rail curves and I'm allowing them to get wider and further apart as we kind of wrap around here. So it'll allow me to show you a few things. Now first off, let me stress the importance of having your profile curve actually touch your rails. If you have any amount of gappage here whatsoever, so there's just a little bit of gappage, I could even, if I wanted to, zoom way in here and just make a nearly imperceptible gap. Just the tiniest amount. And I'll go ahead, whoops, I don't want to do that, but I do want to hide my grid. Let me turn NURBS Hulls back on just in case. To use the Birail 1 tool, we go under Surfaces, Birail, Birail 1, and let me open up the options just long enough to come in here and reset everything. We'll actually talk about the options to this here in just a bit. I'll invoke the tool. Now, in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, the help line is telling you how to use the tool. So if you ever forget, just look down. You have Birail 1 tool. Select the profile curve. In this case, it's this guy. Profile curve selected. Select the 2 rail curves. Here's one rail. Here's the second rail. And in this case, I have just enough closure in between those 2 surfaces for a surface to actually be created. If I were to come in here and make a gap in between the 2, notice how I lose my surface immediately as soon as there's a gap there. So you want to make sure that these these curves are touching one another when you create your Birail. And in most cases, you're going to find it easiest simply to grab your control vertices and just curve snap it down to your rails before you go. And if you do any operation to the curve, if you cut it, if you attach it, if you rebuild it, it's not a bad idea to go in there and just verify that you have snapped everything back into place. Now what I'm going to do is press the Y key, and there's another way you can use this tool. In fact, hang on, let me hit Q and get out of that. You can select your profile and then your rails, and as soon as you invoke the tool, it will actually go ahead and run the operation. Now in this case, we didn't actually get anything because, notice, I have that bit of a gap there. So if you ever see that, you can either undo, and this is kind of an interesting thing, or if you want, you can just leave the operation running, and then go in after the fact and make sure that everything's snapped, and suddenly your surface will come to life. So you have a couple of options. Just don't panic. That's the whole key there. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the options for the Birail 1 tool. First off, we have Transform Control. This has 2 options, proportional and non-proportional. And what this does is this controls how your profile curve is scaled as you sweep along your 2 rails. Notice in this case, as the rails get further and further apart as we come around the bend, the profile gets taller. It's actually being scaled up uniformly and as it sticks to the rails. If we set this to non-proportional, the curve will simply get wider. It won't get taller. Let me go ahead and demonstrate. You'll notice I have an SP Birail surface node. I can take this and switch it to non-proportional, and notice how the curve simply widens out as we sweep along the rails. It doesn't get taller. So if I switch this on, we have proportional, uniform scaling along the surface as we widen out our rails. Down from here, you'll see tangent continuity for your profile. This isn't really going to be useful for us right now. This is if you are using an isoparm on a surface, like an end isoparm, as your profile curve, And having this on will maintain tangential continuity from your original surface to your new Birail, which is something I'll demonstrate here in just a few minutes. Now, from here, now there's the checkbox for that too, if you want to switch on continuity, which right now, of course, we don't really need. If you'd like, you can choose to rebuild either your profile, your first rail, or your second rail. Very handy if you've been doing a lot of attaching, detaching, though if you've been clean in your workflow, you've probably already rebuilt and you won't need these. If you do need them, here they are, and the options you see down here are exactly the same options found under Edit Curves, Rebuild Curves. So you can look those up there. You can change your output geometry, of course, and we've already taken a look at these and some of the other tools. You can go to NURBS, Output to Polygon, Subdivision, or Bezier surfaces. And finally, you have Tool Behavior, which by default is set to exit on completion. So as soon as the surface is done and it's run its course, it'll leave the tool, and this is on by default. You also have auto completion, which means once you've selected a profile and your two rails, the tool will go ahead and complete itself, and then, of course, exit because we have that checkbox on, which is the behavior you saw a second ago. Now, as for keeping tangential continuity with a surface, let me go ahead for now and I'll delete out this example. It seems to have served its purpose. And let's create a NURBS plane. And let's see, I'll frame up on it because it's a little bit small. We'll give it some patches in U and V, and now I'll just do some sort of modeling changes to it. We'll start off by kind of opening it up like a tunnel, but then that in itself is maybe a little bit on the boring side if we're going to be birailing in this direction. So what I'll do is I'll grab these two rows of CVs and I'll tug things up just a little bit, pull this up just a little bit. So this helps show us how we're keeping that tangential continuity. Now what I'm going to do, just to make things a little interesting for us, is I'm going to grab our EP Curve tool. I'll go ahead and curve snap down here to this corner of the surface, and this time we'll just kind of fan outward like so. And then I'll curve snap over here on this one. We'll sort of fan outward as well. Now here's an interesting thing. I can grab this isoparm. I can grab these two rails. We can go to Surfaces, Birail, and run the Birail 1 tool, and we immediately get our surface. Notice it used that end isoparm as our profile curve. Now, also notice under our SP Birail Surface 1 node that tangent continuity profile is currently set to off. So we are not keeping continuity. If I switch this to on, notice that the surface changes to maintain continuity, but also notice that down here where the curves are, we still break the continuity. You can fix this by invoking another one of the NURBS tools you might remember from the Edit Curves menu, Project Tangent, which will project the tangency of this surface into the curve, and it looks like I need to kind of adjust it a little bit. Looks like it went out in the wrong direction, so let's switch this over to V, and that looks a whole lot better. And then we can do the same thing over here. And again, it chose the wrong direction, which is fine. I usually set this kind of thing after the fact. Whoops, looks like I chose the wrong node. Let's go back to Project Tangent 2, set this to V, and there you go. Now, we may need to go in and make further adjustments here. Do not think that this is the end of your tangency. If you were creating this as a model, you'd be doing some attachments, detachments, and just going through your NURBS workflow. But this will help you create a general sort of tangency in between the two surfaces to make attachment and further controls easier down the road. So very cool how that works. And really, that's about it. That's really all there is to this. So one other thing I did want to mention is that you don't necessarily have to have your curves stop on each other. Like your profile curve doesn't necessarily need to end at your rails. For example, I could create a profile curve like so. And as a little bit on the big, it's not too bad. Let me grab my EP Curve tool again, and I'll create one rail curve here and one rail curve here. Now notice the rails are touching, indeed, but the curve doesn't necessarily end on those rails. So let's go ahead and grab our, let's make sure I get my profile, Birail 1 tool like so. We'll grab this as the profile, grab this as the rails, and notice that it still works, but it just takes where the rail's attached into account. So very, very handy feature, especially when you're creating a complex NURBS model out of a cage of splines. You can use Birail very well to create a series of patches. So that's all there is to this tool, and that'll wrap things up for the video over the Birail 1 tool. Thank you very much.